Introduction. The sea is restless. Its dark waves crash against the rocky shores of Scandinavia. And in the spray of salt and wind, a world is born. It is a hard land, long winters, short summers, and soil that must be coaxed into feeding the people. Yet it is also a land of beauty, where fjords carve deep into the mountains and forests whisper with myths older than memory. Here, in the 8th century, families gather in smoke-filled longhouses, telling tales of gods and heroes by firelight. The world is dangerous and uncertain, but also wide and full of promise. For generations, these northern people have farmed, traded, and fought among themselves. Now, with ships that skim the waves like ravens, they will sail out into history. What follows is their story. It is not only a tale of raids and battles, but of farms and families, of belief and law, of journeys that reached from icy Greenland to the warm markets of Byzantium. It is the story of the Viking Age, an age of both terror and wonder. Chapter 1. Before the Viking Age, before the world knew their name, the Norse lived quietly along the edges of Europe. Their homes clung to valleys and coastlines, where farmland was scarce and winters long. Life was not easy, but it was steady, built on the rhythm of the seasons. A traveller entering a Norwegian fjord in the year 700 would see smoke rising from clusters of longhouses. Sheep and goats grazed the hillsides. Fishermen pulled cod from the cold waters. On the highest ground stood a hall, where a chieftain ruled over kin and neighbours. The shape of the land Scandinavia itself shaped its people. Norway's mountains cut farms into narrow strips. Denmark's lowlands offered richer soil, and Sweden's forests stretched toward the east. The land demanded toughness, and the sea offered opportunity. To live here was to respect the earth, but trust the water. Belief and the gods. At night, when the hearth burned low, stories of the gods filled the halls. Odin, the one-eyed seeker of wisdom, who gave up his eye for knowledge. Thor, whose hammer Mjolnir cracked like thunder against giants. Freya, who wept tears of gold. These gods were not distant, but close, walking in the world of men. Sacred groves and stone circles marked places of worship. Sacrifices of animals, and sometimes humans, were offered to earn their favor. The people believed fate, word, bound all lives, but courage could carve a man's name into memory. Society and honor. The Norse lived by honor. A man's reputation mattered more than wealth, and disputes often ended not with forgiveness, but with blood or compensation. The powerful jarls ruled by strength and generosity, while free farmers worked their land and stood in judgment at the thing. The thralls, enslaved through war or trade, carried the hardest burdens. But unlike the kingdoms rising elsewhere in Europe, Norse society allowed for movement. A man of humble birth could rise by skill, and a jarl could fall if he failed to command loyalty. It was a world of uncertainty and possibility, whispers of the wider world. Even before the first great raids, Scandinavians traded with neighbours far to the south and east. Roman coins found in northern soil speak of merchants who carried furs, amber, and iron in exchange for silver and silk. The Norse already knew the seas. Their ships cut across the Baltic, their oars dipping in rhythm. They were farmers, yes, but they were also sailors, hunters, and dreamers. And soon the horizon would call them farther than ever before. Chapter 2. The beginning of the Viking Age. It began, as many sagas do, with blood and fire. In the summer of 793, monks on the island of Lindisfarne went about their prayers. Their stone monastery had stood for generations, a beacon of learning and faith off the coast of Northumbria. The sea was calm, the tide low, until the longships came. Black sails, dragon prows, men leaping ashore with axes and spears. The monks had no walls, no soldiers. The Norse fell upon them with speed and fury. Some were slain, some carried off as slaves, and the holy place was stripped of gold and relics. To the Christians of England, it seemed as if demons had risen from the waves. To the Norse, it was a raid like any other, quick, brutal, and rich with reward. Why they came? Why did the Vikings set sail? Perhaps it was hunger, for their lands could not feed all their sons. Perhaps it was ambition, as chieftains sought glory and silver to bind men to their course. Perhaps it was simply opportunity, for Europe's monasteries lay fat and undefended, their treasures waiting to be taken, and they had the means, the longship, fast, shallow-keeled, able to sail rivers as easily as seas. With these ships, the Norse were no longer bound by their fjords. They could strike anywhere. Raids across the Isles after Lindisfarne came Jarrow, where the venerable Bede had written his histories. Then Iona, where monks fled in terror as raiders descended. By the turn of the century, Ireland's coasts burned, and Dublin would soon become a Norse stronghold. In Scotland, the islands of Orkney and Shetland filled with Norse settlers. In Francia, villages along the Seine and Loire felt the bite of the axe. Everywhere the pattern was the same: ships appearing suddenly, warriors plundering, then vanishing before defenses could gather. The shock of the monasteries. To the Norse, monasteries were easy targets, wealth without weapons. To the Christians, they were sacred sanctuaries, and their violations seemed apocalyptic. Chroniclers wrote of heathen men as scourges sent by God to punish sinful people. But the Vikings were not moved by hatred of Christ. They sought silver, slaves, and renown. What they destroyed, they saw only as the spoils of war. From raids to settlements. At first, the raids were summer expeditions. Men left their farms in spring, plundered through summer, and returned by autumn. But soon some stayed. They built winter camps at river mouths, established trade towns, and took wives among local women. The Norse were no longer just raiders. They were becoming settlers, carving out new homes in foreign lands. A reputation is born. By the middle of the 9th century, the word Viking carried fear across Europe. The sight of sails on the horizon sent villagers fleeing inland. Kings fortified their towns, built armies, and sometimes paid tribute, danegeld, to buy peace. The age of quick raids was ending. In its place was rising something larger, more dangerous: great fleets, armies, and kingdoms. The Viking Age had truly begun. Chapter 3: Viking Society and Daily Life. The fire crackles in the center of the longhouse, smoke curling up toward the rafters where dried fish and meat hang. A child tugs at her mother's woolen dress, while an old man sharpens a knife by the light of the flames. Outside, winter snow presses against the wooden walls, but inside, warmth and life pulse together. This is the world of the Vikings. Not endless raids, but families, farms, and the steady rhythm of survival. The shape of society. If you stepped into a Norse village 1,000 years ago, you'd quickly notice the layers of status. At the top were the jarls, men whose halls were filled with silver, weapons, and warriors loyal to their name. These were the leaders, men who had proven themselves through battle and generosity. Most of the people you'd meet, however, were carls, the farmers and free folk. They tilled the soil, tended animals, and fished the fjords. A carl might own a patch of land, a few sheep, and a long-handled axe that doubled as both tool and weapon. Proudly independent, he could speak at the thing, the assembly where disputes were judged and laws agreed upon. But you would also see the thralls, the enslaved. Perhaps a woman from Ireland, captured in a raid and now grinding grain at the hearth. Or a man from the Slavic lands, bound to labor in the fields. For them, life was harder. Their freedom traded as easily as livestock. Yet in this society, nothing was entirely fixed. A thrall could be freed, a farmer could win fame and fortune, and a jarl could lose everything if he failed to hold loyalty. The Viking world was as restless as the seas they sailed. Women of the north walk into any Viking home, and you'd see that while men wielded the sword abroad, women wielded power at home. The keys to the household often hung from a woman's belt, a symbol of her authority. She managed the stores of grain, the weaving of cloth, the brewing of ale. If her husband sailed off on a raid or voyage, she kept the farm alive through the long months. A strong woman was not unusual. She was expected. Some stories tell of shield maidens who took up arms beside men. Whether myth or reality, the sagas remind us that women could not be easily dismissed. They could own land, divorce a cruel husband, and even demand vergild if wronged. To insult a woman's honor was to invite blood feud. Inside the longhouse. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was the heart of Viking life. Picture it, a great wooden hall, 40 or 50 feet long, its walls lined with benches covered in furs. At the center burned the hearth, its glow flickering against carved beams. Families slept here, side by side, their dreams mingling with the smoke drifting upward. Animals sometimes shared the space, their warmth welcome during brutal winters. By day, the longhouse echoed with the sounds of grinding quernstones, weaving looms, and children's laughter. By night, it became a hall of stories, where skalds recited tales of Odin and Thor, and where the deeds of ancestors lived on in words. The taste of survival, a Viking table groaned not with endless roasted meat, as modern myths suggest, but with the practical fare of survival. Barley bread baked on flat stones, thick porridge seasoned with herbs, goat's milk, and dried fish caught in the fjords. Meat was a luxury, eaten at feasts, or when animals were slaughtered in autumn. Yet when the jarls threw a gathering, the longhouse filled with roasted pork, venison, and ale passed around in horn cups. Mead, the golden drink of honey, was treasured, sweet and strong, said to bring the favor of the gods. Chapter 4. Religion, Belief, and Myth. The night is deep, and the fire burns low in the longhouse. Children lean close as the old skald begins to speak. His voice carries the weight of ages, painting pictures of gods and monsters in the flicker of flame. This is how the Norse understood their world, not through scripture or book, but through story, song, and sacred ritual. Gods among men. In the Viking Age, the gods were never far away. They lived in Asgard, high above, but their presence was felt in every storm, every harvest, every battle. Odin, the All-Father, one-eyed and wise, traded an eye for knowledge at Mimir's well and hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, to win the runes. He was a god of kings and poets, of secrets and fate. Thor, red-bearded and mighty, swung his hammer Mjolnir against the giants who threatened gods and men alike. Farmers and warriors prayed to him for strength and protection. Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, rode a chariot drawn by cats and wept golden tears. She took half the slain to her hall, Folkvanger, while Odin claimed the rest in Valhalla. Loki, the trickster, sly and dangerous, wove chaos wherever he went, a reminder that fate was never secure. These gods were not perfect. They lied, fought, lusted, and schemed, just as humans did. In their flaws, people saw mirrors of themselves. The web of the world. At the center of Norse belief was Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its roots reached into the realms of gods, giants, men, and the dead. Upon its branches perched an eagle, while a dragon gnawed at its roots. Squirrels carried insults between them, as if even the cosmos itself could not escape strife. The 9 worlds of Norse cosmology were bound together by this tree. Asgard, home of the gods. Midgard, the realm of men. Jotunheim, land of the giants. Hell, the shadowy underworld. And beyond them others, mysterious, magical, and perilous. For the Norse, life was a thread in this vast web, fragile yet unbreakably tied to destiny. Rituals and sacrifice. Religion was not confined to stories. It lived in rituals. In sacred groves or wooden temples, offerings were made to the gods. Animals were slaughtered, their blood sprinkled on altars and worshippers alike. At times, human lives were given too. Captives hanged in Odin's name or drowned in bogs for fertility gods. These rites, called blots, bound community to gods, asking for good harvests, safe voyages, and victory in war. Feast followed sacrifice, with meat shared among all, reminding each person that survival was communal, blessed by higher powers. Magic also had its place. Women known as vulvas practiced Seder, a form of prophecy and sorcery. Wrapped in cloaks of fur, staff in hand, they chanted and sang to glimpse the future. Kings sought their counsel before great battles, even as they feared the power they wielded. Death and the afterlife. For the Vikings, death was not an end, but a passage. The manner of one's death mattered deeply. A warrior slain in battle might be carried to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where he feasted and fought until the end of days. Others found themselves in Folkvanger, Freya's field, a place less famed, but equally honorable. Those who died of sickness or old age often went to Hell, a cold and shadowy realm, neither heaven nor hell, ruled by the death goddess Hel herself. Funerals reflected these beliefs. Great men and women were sometimes laid in ships, surrounded by weapons, tools, and treasures to carry into the next life. Some ships were burned upon the water, flames lighting the night sky. Others were buried beneath mounds, the earth swallowing them whole. Even the humblest burial might include grave goods, a comb, a knife, a bead of glass. To the Norse, the dead still walked with their possessions into the beyond. The end of all things, no telling of Norse belief is complete without Ragnarök, the doom of the gods. Someday, they said, the sun and moon would be devoured by wolves. The sky would split, then and giants and monsters would march against Asgard. Odin would fall to the wolf Fenrir, Thor to the serpent Jörmungandr. Fire would consume the world. And yet, from the ashes, a new earth would rise. Survivors would walk its green fields, and life would begin again. It was a faith not of endless paradise, but of cycles, death and rebirth, destruction and renewal. In it, the Vikings saw both the harshness of their world and the promise of something beyond. Living with the sacred religion was not separate from life in the Viking Age. It was woven into every moment. A farmer ploughed with Thor in mind. A sailor cast off calling on Njord for calm seas. A warrior lifted his sword knowing Odin watched. In the crackle of firelight, in the whisper of wind across the fjords, the Norse felt their gods close. Their myths were not distant fables, but living truths, shaping how they saw the world, themselves, and the fate they believed was already written. Chapter 5: Raiders, Traders, and Settlers. The sea was their road. Longships cut across grey waters like arrows, their prows carved with beasts that seemed to snarl at the horizon. From the fjords of Norway, the inlets of Denmark, and the islands of Sweden, the Vikings poured outward, driven by hunger, ambition, and the lure of silver. At first they came as raiders, later as traders, and finally as settlers, planting roots in foreign soil, building new worlds far from their northern homes. The British Isles, blood and fire. The monasteries of England and Ireland were the first to feel the weight of Viking axes. Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Iona, holy places reduced to smoke and ruin. Yet these raids were only the beginning. By the 9th century, fleets of longships swarmed the coasts. The Vikings struck deeper, up rivers, into towns and villages. In Ireland, they turned coastal harbours into bases, and from those bases grew great towns: Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. Once raiders, they became rulers, their presence shaping the island for centuries. England fared no better. Armies of Norse warriors carved out swathes of land, and soon the Danelaw was born, a realm where Viking law and custom ruled in the heart of England. Towns such as York, renamed Jorvik, became bustling centres of trade, filled with crafts, markets, and ships bound for distant shores. Francia and the birth of Normandy. Across the Channel, the rich fields and rivers of Francia lured Viking fleets. The Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne carried longships far inland. Paris itself was besieged, its walls bristling with defenders as Norse armies camped outside, demanding tribute. Again and again the kings of Francia paid Danegeld, silver to buy peace. But peace never lasted long. The raiders always returned. Finally, a different solution emerged. In 911, the Viking leader Rollo was granted land along the Seine in exchange for defending it against other raiders. This land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. From here, the Norse blended with the Franks, adopting Christianity and new customs. Within a few generations, their descendants would launch their own conquest of England itself, Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles. While Francia paid off its invaders, the Isles of the North became Norse strongholds. The Orkneys, Shetlands, and Hebrides filled with settlers who built farms, villages, and halls. From these island bases, Norse fleets raided the coasts of Scotland and beyond. In Ireland, Viking towns grew into centres of power. Dublin especially became a hub for trade, its markets filled with slaves, silver, and goods from as far away as the east. Though the Irish kingdoms fought back, the Norse presence left marks that never fully faded. To the east, the Varangians. Not all voyages went west. Across the Baltic and down the great rivers of Russia, Vikings known as Varangians carved new paths. Their ships glided along the Volkhov, the Dnieper, and the Volga, linking the forests of the north with the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate. They traded furs, slaves, and amber for silver, silk, and spices. Settlements grew into towns, Novgorod, Kiev, and from these would rise the powerful state of Kievan Rus. Here, Norse warriors served not only as traders, but as mercenaries, feared for their discipline and ferocity. Some journeyed all the way to Constantinople, where they entered the service of the Byzantine emperors. Known as the Varangian Guard, these Norsemen became the elite protectors of the empire. Their loyalty bought with gold and honor. The edge of the world, Iceland and Greenland. As Europe reeled under Norse expansion, others looked to the empty seas. Families, not just warriors, began to sail westward, seeking new lands to farm. Around 870, settlers reached Iceland, a land of fire and ice. There they built farms along the coasts, raised cattle and sheep, and created a society with its own assembly, the Althing, that still endures as one of the oldest parliaments in the world. From Iceland, others pushed farther. Around the year 985, Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland, a land harsher still, where icy winds cut across barren coasts. Yet farms clung to the fjords, and for centuries, a Norse community survived at the edge of the habitable world. From raiders to neighbors. By the end of the Viking Age, the Norse had transformed from raiders into settlers and rulers. Where once they struck suddenly and vanished, now they built towns, forged kingdoms, and blended into the lands they had once terrorized. England bore their imprint, Francia became Normandy, Ireland's coasts were reshaped by Norse towns, and the East carried their memory in the rise of Rus. Across the seas, Iceland and Greenland bore witness to their restless drive. The world was larger because of them. The Vikings had stitched Europe, Asia, and even North America together with their ships, leaving a legacy not only of fear, but of connection. Chapter 6: Warfare and Technology. The clash of iron on iron, the roar of men charging into battle, the sight of longships sliding up a riverbank, shields gleaming in the sun. For much of Europe, the Viking Age was an age of fear, and that fear was born from the Norse mastery of war. Yet their power lay not only in savagery, but in skill, technology, and strategy. Weapons of the North, a Viking warrior's weapon was more than steel. It was identity. The sword, the most prized of weapons. A sword was a mark of wealth and status. Forged with skill, often with pattern-welded blades that gleamed with rippling designs, swords bore names and were passed down through generations. A good sword could decide a battle, and to lose one was a blow to a man's honor. The axe. More common than the sword, the axe was the weapon of the free farmer. Simple, versatile, and deadly, it could split wood as easily as skulls. Some axes were massive, with blades so broad they could cleave a man in two with a single stroke. The spear. Cheap and effective. The spear was the most common weapon. Thrown from afar, or thrust in close, it gave reach and precision. To fight with spear and shield was the art of countless Norsemen. The bow. Less celebrated but no less useful. The bow was the hunter's tool and the warrior's ally. On the battlefield, it rained death before the clash of men. In raids, it harried defenders from walls and ships alike. Shields, round and painted, were the Vikings' constant companion. Made of wood, with iron boss, they could block a sword, catch a spear, or lock together to form a wall of defense. Armor and protection. Contrary to modern myth, Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Such an image belongs to opera, not history. The reality was simpler but no less fearsome. Helmets, when owned, were conical, made of iron or leather, often with nose guards. Many men went without, for helmets were costly. Armor was scarce too. The wealthiest warriors wore chainmail shirts, but most relied on thick wool and leather to blunt enemy blows. Mobility mattered more than heavy protection. What the Norse lacked in uniformity, they made up for in adaptability. Each man armed himself as best he could, and together they formed a force both practical and deadly. The longship, weapon of the sea. The greatest weapon of the Viking Age was not sword or axe. It was the ship. The longship, sleek and shallow, could ride the open sea, yet slip up rivers where no army expected them. Its planks overlapped in clinker-built design, strong yet flexible against waves. Its oars could propel it when the wind failed, and its square sail, striped with bold colours, carried it swift across oceans. On the prow, carvings of dragons and serpents loomed, meant to terrify spirits and enemies alike. Shields lined the rails, ready to be lifted in battle. These ships were not only vessels of transport, but engines of conquest, allowing raiders to appear suddenly, strike hard, and vanish before defenders could muster. The longship was the soul of Viking power. Without it, there would have been no raids, no settlements, no empires. Tactics of war. The Vikings did not always fight as disorganized bands. Their methods, though simple, were effective. Surprise! They struck where least expected, on coasts, up rivers, deep into the heart of kingdoms unprepared for attack. Speed was their greatest ally. Shield walls. In battle, warriors locked their round shields together, forming a wall that advanced with steady force. Behind it, spears thrust forward and axes swung. To break such a wall required courage and strength. Feigned retreats. Some sagas speak of cunning tactics, warriors pretending to flee, only to turn suddenly and trap their pursuers. Mercenary service. Norsemen also fought for pay, lending their swords to foreign lords. In these roles, they learned and adapted new strategies, carrying them back to their homelands. Their reputation for ferocity was as powerful as any weapon. Villages often surrendered or fled at the mere sight of sails. The psychological warfare of fear gave the Vikings victories without a fight. Famous battles and campaigns. The Siege of Paris, 845. Ragnar, or one of his kin, led a fleet up the Seine, capturing and terrorizing the city. Only a massive tribute of silver bought its safety. The Great Heathen Army, 865. Not a raid, but a full-scale invasion. This force of thousands swept across England, seizing York and threatening to unite the island under Norse rule. Clontarf, 1014. In Ireland, Norse warriors fought alongside and against local kings in a massive clash near Dublin, a battle that reshaped Irish politics. These battles show the range of Viking warfare, from lightning raids to organized campaigns, from small war bands to armies that shook kingdoms. Chapter 7. The Viking Diaspora. The Viking Age was not simply an era of raids and battles. It was an age of movement, of people leaving their homelands and planting new roots across the known world. The Norse carried their language, customs, and law with them, but they also absorbed the cultures they encountered. In time, the Viking story became not just Scandinavian, but European, stretching from the green fields of England to the golden halls of Byzantium. The Danelaw, Norse England. In the 9th century, waves of Norse warriors swept into England, not just raiding but staying. Villages burned, monasteries fell, and towns were taken. Out of this chaos emerged the Danelaw, a vast swath of territory where Norse law held sway. York, renamed Jorvik, became the heart of this Norse England. Its markets overflowed with goods, amber, iron, furs, and silver from Scandinavia, wine and cloth from Francia, even spices and silks from the east. The streets echoed with voices in Old Norse and Old English, mingling into something new. The people of the Danelaw lived under a fusion of laws. Norse customs such as vergild, the paying of fines for injury or death, blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Place names, ending in by, Thorpe and Athwaite, spread across the land, reminders of Norse settlers who carved farms and villages into the soil. Conflict never ceased. The English kings fought to reclaim their lands, and for centuries the balance shifted. Yet the Danelaw left its mark, a mingling of peoples and cultures that reshaped England's very identity. The Varangian Guard. Some Vikings went farther still. Following the rivers to the Black Sea, they reached Constantinople, the shining capital of the Byzantine Empire. There, emperors hired them as mercenaries, valuing their skill, loyalty, and ferocity. These warriors became the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards. Clad in heavy armor, wielding massive axes, they stood as symbols of strength and terror in the glittering courts of Byzantium. Chroniclers wrote of their unwavering loyalty to the emperor and their fearsome drunkenness when not on duty. In Byzantium, Norsemen walked beneath domes of gold, guarded emperors in purple, and carried back to the north stories of a world of splendor beyond imagination. Normandy and beyond. In Francia, Norse raiders became settlers. Rollo and his descendants ruled Normandy as dukes, adopting Christianity and Frankish ways. Yet they never forgot their warrior roots. From this mingling of Norse and Frank came a new power, one that, in 1066, would change history forever when William of Normandy, descendant of Vikings, conquered England. The Mediterranean Reach. Though less famous, Viking sails even reached the Mediterranean. They raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, struck into North Africa, and traded in distant ports. Everywhere they went, they left echoes of their presence, sometimes in fire and blood, sometimes in the mingling of cultures. Blending of cultures. The Viking diaspora was not only about conquest, it was about change. In every land they touched, the Norse blended with locals, marrying, trading, adopting new words, beliefs, and ways of life. In England, Old Norse shaped the English tongue, leaving words still spoken today. Sky, egg, law, knife. In Ireland, Viking towns became the backbone of commerce. In Russia, the ruling dynasties bore Norse names, even as they became Slavic kings. In Normandy, the descendants of raiders became lords, reshaping medieval Europe. A world made larger, the Viking Age was a time of expansion, not only of borders, but of horizons. The Norse carried their world outward, but they also brought the world home. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate have been found in Scandinavian graves. Byzantine silks once lay on Norse tables. Spices, glassware, and weapons from faraway lands found their way into northern hands. By the time the Viking Age ended, Scandinavia was no longer an isolated corner of Europe. It was a crossroads, connected to the east, the west, and even the far reaches of the Atlantic. The Viking diaspora was not the scattering of a people, but the spreading of influence. The Norse did not vanish into the lands they touched. They became part of them. And in doing so, they changed the map of the medieval world forever. Chapter 8: Kings, Leaders, and Legends. The Viking Age was not only shaped by nameless raiders or wandering traders. At its heart were leaders, some historical, some half-legendary, whose deeds carved their names into the memory of Europe. They were kings, jarls, explorers, and conquerors. Men who turned fleeting raids into lasting kingdoms. Around their lives grew sagas, blending fact and myth until history itself seemed to echo like a story sung by the skalds. Ragnar Lothbrok, legend on the edge of history. Few names from the Viking Age burn brighter than Ragnar Lothbrok, yet historians wrestle with him. Was he a man, or many men woven into one? The sagas tell of a warrior who slew a serpent to win his bride, Lagertha. They speak of raids on Paris, of cunning stratagems, and of countless sons who carried his legacy into the wider world. His death too is legend. Cast into a pit of serpents by the Northumbrian king Ella, Ragnar laughed as he died, singing that his sons would avenge him. Whether Ragnar was real or myth, his story mattered. To the Norse, he embodied the restless spirit of the age. Bold, cunning, doomed, yet defiant. His supposed sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Hvitzur, became leaders of the great heathen army, which swept into England in 865. In Ragnar's legend, fact blurred into saga, but his influence endured. Harald Fairhair, the birth of a kingdom. In Norway, the age of scattered chieftains gave way to kingship under Harald Fairhair. The sagas say he vowed not to cut his hair until he had united all of Norway beneath his rule. Through battle and alliance, he defeated rival jarls and petty kings. His unification of Norway may not have been absolute, but it marked a turning point. The birth of a central monarchy in the north. Those who resisted often fled, sailing west to Iceland and beyond. In this way, Harald's ambition indirectly fueled the Viking expansion outward, as exiles carved new homes across the seas. Harald's reign laid the foundation for a line of Norwegian kings. His story shows how the Viking Age was not only about raids abroad, but about the shaping of nations at home. Leif Erikson, to the edge of the world. If Ragnar embodied legend and Harald kingship, then Leif Erikson symbolized exploration. The son of Eric the Red, who founded Greenland's colonies, Leif sailed farther still. Around the year 1000, he crossed the Atlantic to reach Vinland, a land rich in timber and grapes, widely believed to be part of North America. Though Norse settlements in Vinland did not last, Leif's voyage marked the first known European contact with the New World, centuries before Columbus. To the sagas, he was Leif the Lucky, a man blessed by fortune. To history, he stands as proof of Viking daring, pushing beyond the known world in search of what lay beyond the horizon. Cnut the Great, Emperor of the North Sea. Among Viking rulers, none wielded power greater than Cnut the Great. Rising from Denmark, he conquered England in 1016 after years of war. Soon, he held not only England but Denmark and Norway, forging a North Sea empire that stretched across the northern world. Cnut was not merely a conqueror. He was a ruler who sought legitimacy in both Norse and Christian traditions. He patronized the church, issued laws, and maintained order. His empire, though short-lived, show the potential of Viking power at its height, not only raiding but ruling, not only conquering but governing. His reign stands as the climax of Viking influence in Europe, a moment when the sea was less a barrier than a highway connecting his realms. From saga to history, the Norse remembered their leaders not in chronicles or written histories, but in sagas, tales sung in halls, passed down across generations. These stories blended truth and invention, making kings larger than life, warriors immortal, and explorers eternal. To modern eyes, the sagas can frustrate, their accuracy blurred by time. Yet to the Norse, they captured something deeper than fact. They preserved memory, identity, and the belief that great deeds should never be forgotten. Legends that endure Ragnar. Harold, Leif, Nut, whether legend, king, or explorer, each in his way embodied the Viking spirit. Ambition drove them outward, across seas and into kingdoms. Courage and cunning made them feared and respected. And though their realms rose and fell, their names endured. The Viking Age was not a single story, but many. Yet through its leaders, it gained shape and direction. These figures gave it faces and voices, faces carved on runestones, voices carried in sagas, echoing still in the memory of Europe. The Viking Age was an age of people, but it was also an age of names. Names that turned into legends, and legends that turned into history. Chapter 9. The Decline of the Viking Age. Every age has its dawn, and every age must find its dusk. For 3 centuries, the Vikings had swept across Europe and beyond, their sails darkening the seas, their axes reshaping kingdoms. Yet by the middle of the 11th century, their era began to fade. The reasons were many, some born from within, others forced upon them by the wider world. The Viking Age did not end with one single battle or event. Rather, it unraveled slowly as the forces that had once propelled Norse expansion gave way to new realities. The defenses of Europe. When the first longships struck, Europe was unprepared. Monasteries stood rich and undefended, towns lay open, and kings were slow to respond. But after 2 centuries of raids, Europe had adapted. Fortifications rose along rivers and coasts. Armies trained to meet shield walls with discipline. Fleets were built to challenge Norse ships at sea. In England, Alfred the Great had pioneered the building of fortified towns, burhs, and created a navy, lessons carried on by later kings. In Francia, rulers learned to grant land to Viking leaders in exchange for loyalty, transforming raiders into allies. The element of surprise was gone. Where once the sight of sails caused panic, now it summoned armies ready to fight back. The end of expansion, the Viking drive outward, had been fueled by population pressure, hunger for silver, and the weakness of neighbors. But by the 11th century, the situation had changed. Population growth slowed as new lands were settled in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Silver supplies dwindled as the Abbasid Caliphate weakened and eastern trade routes shifted. Neighbors grew stronger. Their defenses hardened against raids. The opportunities that had once made raiding so profitable were fading. The longship could still carry men far, but the rewards were fewer and the risks greater. The last great kings, even as the age waned, great figures rose to embody its final glories. Nut the Great forged his North Sea empire, ruling England, Denmark, and Norway. Yet after his death in 1035, his realm fractured. unable to withstand the pull of separate kingdoms. Harald Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, dreamed of restoring that empire. A veteran of the Varangian Guard, he brought his army to England in 1066. At Stamford Bridge, he met King Harold Godwinson. The battle was fierce, but Harold fell, struck by an arrow. His death marked the last great Viking invasion. Just weeks later, another descendant of Vikings, William of Normandy, crossed the Channel and conquered England at Hastings. The irony was sharp. The Viking Age ended not with Norsemen raiding, but with their descendants ruling as kings in foreign lands. The fate of the colonies, even as Europe tightened its defences, Norse settlers clung to the edges of the known world. Iceland thrived, with its unique society governed by the Althing. Greenland endured for centuries, though its isolation and harsh climate eventually brought decline. Vinland, the settlement in North America, proved too distant and contested. Hostile encounters with indigenous peoples and the difficulties of supply meant the outpost faded within a few years. The dream of the Western world would sleep for centuries until others came to claim it. From raiders to Europeans. By the close of the 11th century, the Norse had changed. They were no longer outsiders at the edges of Christendom. They were part of it. Scandinavian kingdoms became Christian monarchies, integrated into the political, religious, and economic fabric of Europe. The raiders who had once terrified the continent now stood as kings, dukes, and traders, their swords sheathed beneath the banners of states. The Viking Age was over, but its people remained transformed into something new. The echo of an age. The end of the Viking Age was not the end of the Viking story. Their influence lived on in the kingdoms they helped shape: England, Normandy, Rus. The languages they altered, leaving Norse words in English, Gaelic, and Slavic tongues. The stories they told, preserved in sagas that carried their memory forward. The longships no longer sailed to raid monasteries, but their wake lingered. The Europe of the High Middle Ages bore the imprint of the Norse, in ways both subtle and vast. The twilight of the Viking Age was less a fading into silence than a transformation into something new. Chapter 10: Culture, Society, and Daily Life. Behind the clash of steel and the thunder of longships lay another Viking world, one less often told, but no less vital. The vast majority of Norsemen and Norse women did not spend their lives raiding or exploring distant lands. They farmed, fished, wove, built, and raised families. Their daily struggles and quiet resilience formed the true foundation of the Viking Age. The structure of society, Viking society, was ordered, though not rigidly so. At its core were three broad classes: jarls, what nobles, wealthy landowners, war leaders, and chieftains. They commanded loyalty through gifts, feasts, and protection. Carls, freemen, the backbone of society, farmers, craftsmen, and traders. They could own land, carry weapons, and vote at assemblies. Thralls, Slavs, the lowest class, captured in war or born into bondage. They worked the land, served in households, and could be bought or sold. While the divisions were clear, mobility was not impossible. A thrall could sometimes earn or be granted freedom. A free man could rise in status through wealth or valor. Society was bound by honor and obligation, with loyalty flowing upward and protection downward. Family and household. The Viking household was both home and fortress. Longhouses, built of timber or turf, stretched long and low, with a central hearth as the heart of family life. Smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, blackening rafters but warming the room. Family was the core unit of society. Marriage was less about romance than alliance, binding families through dowries and oaths. Yet affection is evident in the sagas. Men who praise their wives' wisdom, women who mourn their husbands with fierce devotion. Children learned early the skills of survival. Boys trained with weapons, helped in fields, and learned the lore of their ancestors. Girls spun wool, managed households, and prepared for the roles of wife and mother, but could also inherit land, demand divorce, and wield authority in their own right. The role of women. Though far from equals, Norse women enjoyed more rights than many of their contemporaries elsewhere in Europe. They could own property, manage farms in their husband's absence, and play influential roles in family and law. Some women wielded spiritual power as vulvas, searesses, who practiced magic and divination. Others, though rare, took up arms, the so-called shield maidens of legend. Whether they fought often or not, the memory of strong women lingered in saga and story. Law and the thing. The Vikings valued law as much as battle. Their assemblies, known as things, gathered freemen to decide disputes, make alliances, and pass judgment. The law was not written but remembered, recited by law speakers who held the community's trust. Justice was based on compensation. A vergild, man price, set the value of injury or death, to be paid by the guilty to the victim's kin. Violence was not absent, but law sought to prevent endless feuding by placing structure on vengeance. In Iceland, the Althing became one of the earliest forms of parliamentary government, where chiefs and farmers alike had their say. The thing embodied the Norse belief that freedom and responsibility went hand in hand, farming and work. Despite their reputation as warriors, most Norse were farmers. Fields of barley, rye, and oats fed their families, while cattle, sheep, and pigs provided meat and milk. Fishing supplemented the diet, with cod and herring abundant along the coasts. Life was laborious. Fields had to be ploughed, hay cut and stored for winter. Animals tended in barns through the cold months. Tools were simple, ploughs of wood and iron, scythes and sickles, but effective. Seasons dictated life: sowing in spring, harvesting in summer, slaughter in autumn, endurance in winter. Craftsmen thrived in Viking towns. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Carpenters built ships and houses. Weavers spun wool into cloth. Their skill was not only practical, but artistic. Brooches, carvings, and runestones reveal a people who valued beauty in daily life. Food and drink meals were hearty, if plain. Bread baked from barley or rye, porridge thick with grains, stews of meat and root vegetables. Fish was dried or smoked for winter storage. Honey provided sweetness, while ale was the common drink. Mead, made from fermented honey, was reserved for feasts. Feasts themselves were central to culture. In a lord's hall, tables groaned with meat and drink, while skalds recited poetry, and warriors boasted of deeds. Such gatherings were not mere indulgence. They were politics, cementing loyalty and honor through shared abundance. Chapter 11. Religion, Belief, and Myth. To understand the Viking Age, one must step into the world of the Norse gods, A world where fate was woven by unseen hands, where storms carried the hammer blows of Thor, and where every battle was a rehearsal for the final war at the end of days. Religion for the Vikings was not confined to temples or priests. It was lived daily, a thread running through their work, their feasts, and their deaths. The Pantheon of the North. The Norse gods were many, divided not into one simple family, but into two great tribes. The Aesir, led by Odin, were gods of power, war, and kingship. Odin himself was the All-Father, wise, mysterious, and often ruthless, trading an eye for knowledge and hanging himself upon the world tree Yggdrasil to gain the secrets of runes. The Vanir, gods of fertility and prosperity, brought balance to the harsh northern life. Freya governed harvests and peace, Freya love and magic. These two tribes, once at war, reconciled, symbolizing a world that valued both strength and fertility, war and peace. Other figures fill the Norse cosmos. Thor, defender of gods and men, wielding his hammer Mjolnir against giants and chaos. Loki, trickster and shapeshifter, both ally and enemy of the gods, destined to bring ruin at Ragnarok. Hel, mistress of the underworld, ruling the dead who did not fall in battle. Together, they formed not a pantheon of perfection, but a reflection of human life. Complex, flawed, yet bound by honor and destiny, the worldview of fate. At the heart of Norse belief lay Wood, fate. All beings, even the gods, were subject to it. The Norns, mysterious weavers at the roots of Yggdrasil, spun the threads of life, binding mortals and immortals alike. This sense of inevitable destiny shaped Viking courage. If the day of death was fixed, then fear was pointless. A warrior entered battle, not in hope of survival, but in hope of glory, for his fate was already sealed. The myth of the end, Ragnarok. The Norse did not imagine a world of eternal peace, but one destined for destruction. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was the great myth of endings. Wolves would devour the sun and moon. The seas would break, releasing the serpent Jormungandr. Loki would lead giants against the gods. Odin would fall to the wolf Fenrir. Thor to the serpent's venom. The world would burn, sink into the sea, and rise anew, green and fresh. This vision of inevitable doom did not inspire despair, but courage. If even the gods could not escape fate, then what mattered was how one met it. Bravely, with honor, leaving behind a name worth remembering. Belief as identity religion for the Norse was not only about gods and rituals, it was about identity. To honor the old gods was to affirm kinship, land, and tradition. To adopt Christianity was to step into a new world of kingship, literacy, and European power. The Viking Age was a bridge between these two worlds. One foot in the realm of Odin and Thor, the other in the kingdom of Christ. That tension shaped the very soul of the age. Echoes of faith. Though the old gods faded, their memory endured. Stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki survived in sagas and poems. Folklore carried whispers of trolls and droga. Even Christianity in the north bore marks of pagan pasts, as festivals and customs wove together old and new. Today, the myths of the Vikings are known across the world, symbols of defiance, courage, and fate. What began as faith became story, and what became story became legend. The Vikings lived by their gods, died with their gods, and carried them across seas and centuries. Their myths gave meaning to hardship, courage to warriors, and pride to families. In the clash between paganism and Christianity, one age ended and another began. But the echo of the old world never fell silent. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the Vikings. The Viking Age ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond the 11th century. Raids became memories, longships rotted in fjords, and pagans became Christian subjects of kingdoms. Yet the impact of the Norse endured, shaping Europe, the North Atlantic, and even the imagination of the modern world. Language and names. The Vikings left words behind that survive to this day. In England, Old Norse merged with Old English, giving rise to words like sky, knife, window, egg, and law. Place names such as Grimsby, Whitby, and Derby mark the traces of settlements and personal names of Norse settlers. Even in France, Normandy preserves the memory of Rollo's men, while in Ireland, towns like Dublin and Waterford reflect the Norse presence. In every corner of the lands they touched, Norse names and words endured, proof of integration rather than annihilation. Law and governance. The Norse contributed to the development of legal and parliamentary systems. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930, is one of the oldest known parliamentary assemblies in the world. Its model of collective governance, law-speaking, and dispute resolution influenced the evolution of civic structure in Scandinavia. In England, Danelaw introduced legal concepts that survived into the medieval period, shaping property rights, compensation systems, and local governance. Even where conquest ended, the structures the Vikings introduced lingered. Exploration and settlement. Vikings were explorers in every sense. From Iceland to Greenland, and for a brief time, Vinland, they pushed the known world outward. They connected lands across the North Atlantic, establishing trade routes that carried furs, walrus ivory, timber, and slaves. Their ventures eastward shaped the Kievan Rus, integrating Scandinavia with the Slavic world. They navigated rivers to Byzantium, serving as Varangians, and extended their influence into the Mediterranean. Exploration was not only about adventure, it reshaped geography, politics, and commerce, art, craft, and culture. The artistic legacy of the Vikings is evident in carvings, jewelry, weapons, and runestones. Interlacing patterns, serpents and dragons adorned everyday objects and ships alike. Their culture valued storytelling, poetry, and music, preserving their worldview for centuries in sagas and Eddas. Even their ships were masterpieces, designed not only for speed and efficiency, but for beauty. Longships reflected technological sophistication and artistic sensibility, balancing practicality with form. Warrior spirit and myth. The myth of the Viking warrior endures in modern imagination. They are remembered as brave, cunning, and unyielding, whether in sagas, literature, or popular culture. The archetype of the Viking, long-haired, axe-wielding, fearless, remains a symbol of adventure and resilience. Yet this image is only part of the truth. Vikings were also farmers, traders, lawmakers, and poets. Their society was complex, adaptable, and capable of transformation. To remember them solely as raiders is to forget the depth of their culture. Integration into Europe. By the end of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had integrated fully into European Christendom. Kings ruled from Trondheim, Oslo, and Copenhagen. Merchants traded with Constantinople, Baghdad, and London. Peasants tilled lands under both Christian and old laws. The Vikings themselves became part of the kingdoms they had once raided. In Normandy, England, Ireland, and Russia. Their bloodlines, culture, and leadership became threads in the fabric of European history. Modern echoes today, the Viking legacy survives in multiple forms. Historical and archaeological study, uncovering longships, burial mounds, and runestones. Popular culture, from films and television to literature, shaping a romanticized image of the Norse. National identity, particularly in Scandinavia, where Viking heritage informs history, pride, and tourism. The Viking Age reminds us that influence is measured not only by conquest, but by endurance, by the lasting marks left in law, language, art, and imagination. The enduring spirit. The Vikings were explorers, traders, warriors, and storytellers. They sailed beyond horizons, built towns and empires, and carried their gods and myths across continents. They adapted, integrated, and transformed both themselves and the lands they touched. Though their longships no longer roam the seas, their spirit remains. In courage, innovation, and the willingness to venture into the unknown. The Viking Age may have ended, but the legacy of its people lives on. In Europe, in the North Atlantic, and in the stories we tell.